The death penalty itself is the pinnacle of a system of justice based upon the idea that evil deeds should be punished. And one of the reasons why the radical left was so keen to remove it, because they don't really believe in the principle of punishment. If you want to argue about the death penalty in the United States, I could pin you to the wall for hours about it. I know lots about it. I don't want that kind of help. I want the support for the death penalty not to be emotional, but to be reasoned. In the case of armed and violent criminals who have actually killed somebody in particularly heinous circumstances, we have, I think, the duty to make it plain to others who were thinking of doing the same thing that we're prepared to kill them in return.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. Are you in favour of the death penalty? Here in the UK, the government removed its own right to sentence murderers to death in 1965, and yet opinion poll after opinion poll since that date consistently shows that most people, when asked, will say yes, they are in favour of the death penalty for some cases. It's become one of those essay questions pointed to in polite society almost as an example of how you don't necessarily want untrammelled democracy. But with the horrific murder of young girls in Southport by Axel Rudakubana recently, the question has been asked once again on social media. And one of the few people who will openly defend support for the death penalty is none other than Peter Hitchens. He's no stranger to taking a controversial position when necessary. He has written a fantastic essay for UnHerd today, making that case, and we thought we'd better get him into the studio to explain himself. Welcome back once again, Peter.
It's a joy to be here.
We're briefly interrupting the show for a word from our sponsor. Some struggle to fall asleep, others to stay asleep, and many wake in the night with racing thoughts. I often wake up in the middle of the night tossing and turning for what feels like hours. I found out that saffron is more than just a spice. It's shown in multiple human studies to help you fall asleep faster, stay asleep longer, and wake up refreshed without next day grogginess. It works by boosting natural melatonin without dependency or morning fog, calming the nervous system, helping your mind unwind, improving mood and stress resilience so you wake up feeling better. Most saffron supplements don't work because they contain cheap, unstandardized saffron cut with fillers or low-potency extracts, delivering weak, inconsistent doses. Unlike today's sponsor, Verso, whose Evening Being is a melatonin-free drink mix perfected over 3 years with a clinically studied trademark saffron, standardized and concentrated to only the active ingredients, proven to enhance sleep, mood and relaxation. It's the most researched bioavailable saffron extract available. It's paired with other clinically studied, patented ingredients to help promote relaxation and deep, uninterrupted sleep. After taking Evening Being, I find I fall asleep a lot quicker, have less haunting dreams, and wake up feeling unusually refreshed and ready to face the day. Click the link in the description or head over to ver.so and use coupon code UnHerd at checkout to save 15% on your first order.
A quote from your UnHerd essay today. You say, "Properly conducted capital punishment makes a country less vengeful and more gentle." How so?
First of all, justice, properly applied and firmly applied, is one of its main functions, is to avoid the blood feud and the desire for revenge. If people know that the state, that the courts will fiercely punish wrong and evil actions, then they are much, much less likely to seek to take the law, as we say, into their own hands. And they're much less likely to seek personal revenge. It's a simple, straightforward, unassailable fact about life. As for gentler, I would say, it's a matter of example. Before this country eviscerated its death penalty in the middle to late 1950s, this was a very peaceful society. And one of the things which marked it out, and I think this is deeply connected with the fact that we had a death penalty, was that we were probably one of the only major countries with an unarmed police force. The police didn't need to be armed. The courts were armed, and therefore people understood that if they broke certain laws, then they would face death. Not just a talking to and a few years in prison, but death, and it had a very powerful effect. It made us, as I say, a more peaceful society than we are now.
I mean, we still have an unarmed police force.
Well, we don't. We have very much a partly armed police force, and if they hadn't invented tasers, I think we would now have an armed police force. And it's a very unsatisfactory substitute. The police officer has to take a split-second decision. There's no due process, there's no arrest, there's no charge, there's no trial, there's no hope of reprieve or appeal. Perhaps the worst example of this in modern times is the case of Jean-Charles de Menezes, which so poignantly and movingly and disturbingly pictured in the new drama Suspect, in which the police killed a totally innocent man. Thinking, as they did it, that they were doing the right thing. And since then, nobody has ever taken responsibility for it. And this extraordinary people who would have campaigned against hanging and did so, moan a bit about events like this. And there are quite a few of them where people are shot without any good reason. But there is no real resentment of the idea that the state can just shoot you by mistake and nothing will happen to anybody.
So the key part of your argument seems to be, at least so far, a kind of practical, almost utilitarian argument,
there
which
is a utilitarian argument
it will
for
improve society.
There's not much use my arguing on a religious basis with most people in a secular country. There are very good utilitarian arguments for it. John Stuart Mill, to the amazement of many liberals, was in favour of and made a very powerful speech in favour of the death penalty, for instance. And the utilitarian case for it is, in my view, unanswerable. So I will make it because it will reach people. I can certainly make a religious case for it as well. When I do so, it's very similar to the case for just war.
Well, let's start with the utilitarian aspect. Mm-hmm. Because you talk about the mid-1950s as the comparator, and I think few people would disagree with you that it was a less violent time, but a lot of things other than the removal of the death penalty have changed since then. You could point to all sorts of things that conservatives go on about all the time, discipline in schools, immigration, family life, etc., etc. There's not that much evidence, I don't think, that the death penalty itself is responsible for that change.
Well, the death penalty itself is the pinnacle of a system of justice based upon the idea that evil deeds should be punished. And one of the reasons why the radical left was so keen to remove it, certainly from criminal justice, though I have to say the radical left are often quite keen on executing people for political reasons, they wanted to remove it from criminal justice because they don't really believe in the principle of punishment of wrong deeds. They believe that crime arises out of social problems and that it's a disease which needs to be treated, and that basically the state is a mediator between the offender and the victim rather than the punisher of wrongdoing and the wielder of the civil sword. So it's conceptually a problem for them. And of course, when they were getting rid of the death penalty, they were getting rid of an awful lot of other aspects of life which were based on the idea that people were personally responsible for their actions and could face punishment for them. So yes, it hasn't alone achieved this worsening in society and the spread of violence and unpleasantness of all sorts which has followed, but it was a key part of it, and it was an essential part of it. They had to get rid of it as part of a general reform. I mean, our prisons, for instance, now do not punish or attempt to punish. They're warehouses. And that's one of the reasons why they don't work. They've got more people in them than they ever had before, but they completely fail to work because they're not punitive.
I mean, the other glaring problem with the utilitarian argument, or the idea that it will make society less violent or safer, is looking at other countries abroad. The United States is a famous example which has the death penalty still and has a worse homicide rate than us. But if you look up some of the countries at the very top of the global league table for willful murders, thinking of Nigeria, Jamaica, Somalia, for example, they all have the death penalty.
I'm concerned only with this country. The differences between this country and the countries that you name are huge. The United States has a terrible history of slavery and appalling racial bigotry and of much higher levels of violence than we do. In any case, the death penalty only exists as a fiction there. I mean, some people are executed. I've seen 2 people executed in the United States, so I know that it happens, but it's extraordinarily rare, and it's a kind of street theatre rather than a form of justice. It's designed to make the politicians in charge of the particular state look tough, rather than actually to operate a deterrent system of punishment. You take I think the state of Texas might execute a dozen people in a year. 1,000 times as many homicides are committed. It's not being done as a deterrent, and in many of the states which technically have the death penalty, it's never actually applied at all.
So you would like to see it?
If you want to argue about the death penalty in the United States, I could pin you to the wall for hours about it. I know lots about it, but I would not recommend what they have, and nor would I want to live in their type of society, which is very different from ours.
But the central idea there is that the American implementation of the death penalty is not succeeding in helping towards a more peaceful society.
Well, it's not trying
in part because they don't do it enough. You would have them do it more?
It's the way in which they do it. Both the people I saw executed had done their crimes many years before they were executed and had probably forgotten what they'd done. That's not an effective form of penalty. But
hold on. So it's not only they need to do more, and they need to do it quicker.
There needs to be some connection between the crime and the punishment, rather than a matter of many years between the two. It would seem to me.
But does it not take?
I don't want to be sidetracked into it. As I say, I can discuss the American death penalty if you want, but do you really think? Because you've visited both countries, do you really think that they're remotely comparable socially as countries? Do they operate in the same way? For goodness sake, people are allowed to carry weapons, firearms in the United States. It's not the same kind of society. I'm not arguing about it. I can do, but it means that the whole thing wanders off into the sand, and we don't discuss the actual issues, which is whether we could or should have it here, a country that we know and understand, and where we can see the effects of having got rid of it.
I think it's still quite instructive to look across at our Anglo neighbours and see what's going on there. And I guess your point is an interesting one. Very often, even though it's technically allowed, very often it gets negotiated away in a long legal process, and it takes a hell of a long time to make sure that the conviction is rock solid, and normally many years.
The conviction of Nicholas Lee Ingram, who I saw executed in the electric chair in Georgia in, I think, 1992, was beyond doubt just. There were witnesses. He tried to murder two people, J.C. Sawyer and his wife Mary, and he shot them both, but his second bullet missed Mary, so she was actually standing there when he had shot her husband and was able to give evidence that he'd killed her. There wasn't any doubt that he was a particularly heinous murderer. He tortured them both before he killed them. He tied them to a tree with wire. He jeered at them, and then he shot them both. So everybody knew he was a killer. It took years to execute him, nonetheless.
And when you say you watched it, were you actually present?
I was present at
in the room.
His electrocution. Yes, I was shown pictures of what his victim had looked like by somebody who came up to me shortly before I went in. It was horrible. I felt several years older after I'd seen it than before.
And yet that process and that experience didn't put you off?
No, I thought it was my duty. I was living and working in the United States. I discovered that as a British correspondent, I could witness an execution, which is something I couldn't do here. I thought, as a reporter, it was my job to see it as it was something that I thought was probably necessary for a justice system, so it would be idle and cowardly not to witness it myself, so I did. For partly the reason that you mentioned, so that no one could ever say to me again, oh, well, if you'd seen it, you wouldn't be in favour of it.
To conclude then on this central question, which is the so-called utilitarian argument, whether it makes society safer, it's fair to say that the jury's still out on that, though, isn't it? I mean, the country we're in, the United Kingdom, has a relatively low murder rate.
Well,
we haven't got the death penalty.
But you're making the usual mistake people make, that the point of the death penalty is to deter murder as such. Some murders, crimes of passion and so forth, are undeterrable anyway, and will never be deterred. Some kinds of murder, particularly the stranger murder, where the person kills the person he's robbed or raped, are calculations where the killer decides that if there's no real difference in the sentence that he'll get for the one, that he might as well kill the only witness to his crime. That kind of crime has actually gone up quite considerably in the United States since the death penalty was more or less made ineffectual, 50-odd years ago now by the Supreme Court. I mean, it's come back, but it very much more weakly. That sort of murder is more common, but there are other things. A very interesting man called Colin Greenwood, who wrote probably the best book on firearms control in this country, looked into what happened during the two periods in the history of Britain when the death penalty was suspended. During 1948, when Parliament was trying quite hard to get rid of it, and then again 55 to 57, when the 57 Homicide Act was going through. And he found out that during that period, the amount of armed crime, the use of weapons by criminals and violent crime went up sharply during the suspension. After the 48 suspension ended, it dropped very sharply. After the 57 Act went through, which was weaker than it had previously been, it dropped, though not as sharply, and then it went up much more when the penalty was abolished in 65 and has continued to go up ever since. Another point is the fact that if we had the National Health Service of 1955, or indeed 65, many more people would die in this country, particularly from knife wounds, than do. We have fantastically good trauma surgery now, and many people's lives are saved by brilliant medical intervention whose lives would not have been saved 50 or 60 years ago. So if you're trying to look at a comparison between the homicide rates of then and now, you need to take that into account. The other point, of course, is the classification of homicides when they actually take place. Are they listed as murders or manslaughters or something else? And the law constantly shifts about. But even when you take that into account, the number of homicides has greatly increased in this country since the death penalty was abolished.
It must be said that those improvements in hospital care have also taken place in other countries that continue to have a much worse murder rate than we.
Well, you may think that's an absolutely astounding point, but it doesn't make much impression on me. To the argument that I'm offering you, I'm saying there has been an increase in in lethal and dangerous violence, the use of lethal weapons, and there has been an increase in homicide, quite a substantial one, both directly connected with the suspension of the death penalty, which ended when that suspension came to an end, and also directly connected with the abolition of it. And I think that although post hoc ergo propter hoc is never a good argument by itself, and that correlation is not necessarily causation, there must be some reason to think that there could be a connection between the two.
That's the kind of social science part. People can draw their own conclusions on how strong that correlation is.
Well, if they'll look into it and look at these figures that are actually available, if you look, then yes, they will see that it is idle and wrong to say that violence and homicide have not increased since the death penalty got rid of.
Another objection that people often have is the idea that were there to be a wrongful conviction, a single wrongful conviction which led to the death penalty, that in itself would be worse somehow than having dozens of murderers continuing to be alive but in prison. And obviously you have been particularly vocal about the Lucy Letby trial. You consider that to be a recent potent example of a wrongful conviction.
Well, I do. I can't. I think the conviction as it stands on the evidence presented to the court is unsafe. But you have to understand that under current circumstances, the British justice system is barely fit to find somebody for a parking offence. It is so completely emotionalised and politicised, and without merit that it certainly couldn't be trusted with the decision over whether somebody should be executed. And I would not argue for a second for the death penalty to be brought back with our courts in their current position. They're so particularly. I mean, the majority verdict. The majority verdict is an outrage against the jury system. It completely destroys the idea of beyond reasonable doubt. If one person on a jury has enough reasonable doubt, then that is not a conviction. And yet now we're constantly permitting convictions, whether one, sometimes three people on the jury who won't agree. So we couldn't conceivably execute somebody with majority verdicts. And then there's another thing: at what age does somebody qualify for jury service?
18.
Exactly. Would you want your fate to be decided by an 18-year-old with no life experience? It's an absurd position. If we can't have an educational qualification, which people say we can't, then we must at least have an experience qualification, that people don't go on juries until they've seen a bit of life. But as they are at the moment, they're not a reliable barricade against wrongful conviction. And as the Blair government's emotionalisation of criminal justice of various kinds has also made it much, much easier, it seems to me, for prosecutors to make their cases without actually adducing any evidence. So, as happened in the case of Lucy Letby. I mean, there is not any actual objective evidence that she did anything wrong, and yet she's now rotting in prison for the next 50 years.
Yeah, we could definitely get sidetracked onto
Well, we could do, yeah. But I mean, you're saying, but what I would retrack us on is this: you say it would be appalling for anybody to be wrongfully executed, and I agree with you. And I think every effort should be made to avoid it. And I think with modern science, particularly DNA, we're much better able to avoid it than we used to be. But what about the wrongful shooting of people by the police? No one ever complains about that. It's just it happens. And the killing of de Menezes came. There was an inquest. Nobody has taken responsibility for it. Nothing's happened about it. The police are still armed, and they still. I regret to say this, and I feel very sorry for the officers involved. They still, from time to time, shoot innocent people, or people against whom there certainly isn't enough of a case to hang anybody. And that nobody cares. The reason for this is because this is actually about how much responsibility our political class are prepared to take. If they can shuck off the responsibility for capital punishment onto individual police officers, who can then be disowned or left swinging in the wind, that's okay. What they did in 1965 was they said, we, the political class, are no longer prepared to take responsibility for defending our society against evil with serious measures. They weren't prepared to do it. They weren't even prepared to go to the electorate and say this is what they were going to do. It was not done on the basis of any manifesto. Harold Wilson's manifesto of 1964 had not said he would abolish the death penalty. He did it hiding behind Sidney Silverman's private member's bill, which was, of course, covertly assisted through the House of Commons by the government whips, but was always pretended to be private. So nobody was ever held to account at the ballot box for that piece of legislation, and yet, never has been.
And yet I think what you've just said is that in the real world, you would not actually favour reintroducing the death penalty because you are not confident enough in the justice system.
I would first of all reform the justice system. It wouldn't be difficult to reform the justice system to make it more effective. As I say, the abolition of majority verdicts could be done tonight. The introduction of an age and experience qualification for jury service could be done tonight, and a number of the Blairite changes in criminal justice, the way in which trials are conducted, could also be got rid of. That wouldn't be particularly difficult.
So your support for the death penalty is more of a theoretical one, or it's a contingent?
No, it's not theoretical.
It's a contingent one based on a series of other reforms that would need to go along with.
If you have a serious penalty, you have to have a serious justice system. We don't. The one would stimulate the creation of the other. That would be a good thing in all ways.
One of the things you mention in your UnHerd essay is that young people, at least by one opinion poll that was taken recently by an organisation called More in Common, young people are somewhat more likely to support the death penalty, the youngest cohort, than older cohorts. Is this a reason to support it, or what do you take from that?
I don't welcome it at all, because an awful lot of those polled also wanted an armed police force, which I find a repellent idea. So no, I think it's basically the result of a society without any profound moral basis, in which people see among them an awful lot of people behaving extremely badly and would like to see a stronger state to deal with it. I think it goes together with the general support for all kinds of other suspect measures, like lengthening the time you can hold people in custody without charge and things like that, which have had considerable support over the past few years. I don't welcome it at all.
So you're
I don't want that kind of help. I want the support for the death penalty not to be emotional, but to be reasoned, as J.S. Mill's support for the death penalty would.
So actually, those people who are with you on this central question, you essentially reject, because
I often do. I often find that I'm supported by people who I don't actually wish to be supported by, and I don't get the impression that this surge is something that has actually much to do with what I want or why I want it.
Well, it's more perhaps to do with the fact that the youngest generation is not especially keen on democracy either. They are somewhat of an illiberal generation, at least if you're going to be kind of stereotyping of them.
That's because, it's not necessarily democracy, that's because law-governed societies, under the influence of left-wing ideology, as they have been for the past 50 years, have become weak societies. And people don't like that. They don't want to be governed by people who are weak. I see no reason why a law-governed democracy has to be a weak society. I think it can be strong. But to do so, it has to stop being pathetically emotional about the death penalty and be reasonable about it. Look, an awful lot of the people who you'll find saying, I couldn't possibly support the death penalty because somebody innocent might be killed. And these are the same people who've supported, they say they didn't now, they did, they supported the Iraq invasion in 2003, they supported the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, and they supported David Cameron's adventure in Libya in 2011. Now, in all those cases, in idealistic, supposedly wars of choice, for supposedly stepping in on the side of goodness, innocent people were killed, sometimes very horribly, and nobody gave a tinker's curse. The liberals, it's not, they don't really mean it when they say they're not thinking about what they're saying, but because it's never debated, they're never confronted with this. There are so many policies, even and including our traffic policy in this country, which depend pretty much on the inevitable deaths of innocent people. It's amazing how many of them there are, but people put up with it all the time. But if it comes to saying, no, actually, we must stand against the growth of violence and the use of weapons in our society by restoring, for very limited use, the death penalty for certain heinous murders. Oh, no, you couldn't do that. Somebody else might get hurt. It's not their real reason for being against it. Their real reason is they want a peaceful, ordered society, but they're not prepared to pay the price for it. They're very similar to pacifists who say, yes, I want us to be safe from foreign invaders. I don't want people to be able to march in and impose their laws on us and tax us to pieces and make our lives a misery, but I won't support an adequate defence budget. This is, as I say, basically a just war question. Ultimately, if you want to defend yourself, you will have to accept that in the course of defending yourself, somebody might get hurt.
So just to recap then, there are two groups that you just strongly rejected. There's the somewhat illiberal younger group that maybe are just frustrated about a chaotic society, aren't that keen on liberal institutions generally, and kind of have turned to a hang 'em and flog 'em type of attitude. You think they are making...
I don't know about flogging. I'm not sure they have anything so much to say about flogging, and nor indeed I have to say do I.
But you reject the liberal end of our society, and similarly the people who consider themselves liberals...
It's because they're humbugs.
Who are,
they claim,
for example...
They claim to be worried about something that in practice they're not worried about.
So the people who considered themselves liberals, who might have been a kind of David Cameron-style conservative, might have gone along with his Libya campaign, what you're saying is there's hypocrisy there, because
Cameron
they were
himself
prepared...
said he was against the death penalty because somebody innocent might get hurt. Well, I promise you innocent people got hurt during his Libya campaign.
So this is the comparison between the death penalty and a just war argument.
Well, yes, it's not a comparison. They are fundamentally the same argument. The threats to a society don't only come from external enemies; they come from internal enemies. They come from they come from internal disorder, from people who are not prepared to accept the law and won't obey it, and who prey upon their neighbours. Something has to be done about them, and there are lots of parts of this country where life is absolutely miserable for the poor and the weak because their neighbours prey upon them without restraint, and that, in my view, ought to end.
I think it must be possible to be philosophically coherent and approve of just war in certain restricted circumstances, but disapprove of the death penalty.
Well, explain it to me then.
Is there not a categorical difference between acting under duress in the heat of a moment to prevent further harm, such as when responding to an invasion or certain just war scenarios, but yet when you have a safe prisoner in one of your institutions, to voluntarily choose to end their life is a different kind of moral question?
No, it isn't. First of all, if you're going to defend yourself as a nation, you have to maintain serious armed forces which are capable of considerable and lethal violence at any time. You have to train people to do that and have them ready to do that. They will almost certainly, in the course of that training and of being maintained, kill some people accidentally, I might add. Secondly, the person, you also forget the purpose of deterrence. Now, the maintaining of those armed forces is deterrent if people know they are effective. That's why we invite the military attachés of countries we don't much like to come and look at our naval and military exercises, so they know what we can do. In the case of armed and violent criminals who have actually killed somebody in particularly heinous circumstances, we have, I think, the duty to make it plain to others who were thinking of doing the same thing that we're prepared to kill them in return.
Let's get religious for a moment, Peter, because you mentioned before we started filming that when you have 2 minutes to discuss this on the BBC, no one is interested in going into moral or ethical or religious questions.
No, but on the BBC I'm just a barbarian anyway, so it doesn't...
Well, barbarians are welcome here. And one of the points you mention in your UnHerd essay is that you think there is a Christian or a theological defence of the death penalty, whilst many people's first argument against it is that it's somehow unchristian. Why are they wrong?
Well, I don't know what Christian text they would be relying on to say that there is, or indeed any biblical text, to say that the lawful execution of a guilty person who's committed a heinous crime is wrong. Where is this stated in either the Old Testament or the New? Where did Christ say it? I mean, he was himself executed in public. An excellent opportunity, you might think, to offer an opinion on the subject. He offers none.
I think there might be theological arguments against it.
Well, there are. There are theological arguments for and against practically anything. But if you simply want to bring it down to what is there in the Christian religion which obliges you to disarm yourself against evil crime in your midst, I don't think you can find anything.
Well, once you've secured someone and have them the opportunity to keep them in prison, you have then disarmed them. I suppose, I'm not a theologian, but I would suppose that a central part of the Christian message is, first of all, redemption should be a possibility. So ending someone's life, it ends their possibility of being redeemed in that way or making good for their sins. I feel like a kind of the central mood of the New Testament is towards
the old
redemption and forgiveness.
Dr. Johnson argument actually made in a different context, but still it seems valid. The prospect of being hanged in a fortnight concentrates a man's mind wonderfully well if you want him to feel any kind of redemption. But there's a problem of forgiveness, which is that the principal victim of the murderer is not in a position to forgive him. And we cannot, on behalf of that murdered person, forgive him either. It's not within our power to do so, and that's one of the reasons why murder attracts this special treatment in criminal justice systems. That the only person who can forgive is in no condition to do so.
So, if I were a devout Christian who felt like each human life is in the image of God and must be treated as sacred, and that it somehow surpasses my moral right to take someone's life when I have an option not to, which is basically what you do when you kill someone who is in prison, what would you say to them?
Well, if that's the conclusion you come to, it's the conclusion you come to, but you can't come to it on the basis of anything in the Scripture. It's an opinion. And also, I'd say, do you apply the same theory to war and national defence? And if so, are you prepared to accept the consequences for you and others of doing so?
In this actual world that we're actually living in, what would you like to see happen? The person we mentioned there in the introduction, Axel Rudakubana, would you consider him a candidate for the death penalty?
It's futile to argue about people who committed crimes when the law didn't specify the death penalty for them. You can't retroactively impose any penalty on anybody. So no, I also have my strong suspicions that Rudakubana is one of the many people now at large in our society who has had his mind destroyed by drugs. I can't prove it and the state isn't interested in establishing it, but I suspect it very strongly from his behaviour of not dealing with a rational person here. And a deterrent system of execution is actually aimed particularly at rational people. So I'm not particularly interested in using that case as an example, no.
Are there any cases, or are they just trying to make it into a real possibility or a real to focus minds on what it might actually look like were you to win the argument and were a future government to consider it? Let's just say, for example, that reform comes in 4 years' time and they start talking about bringing back the death penalty. You would like to see that happen?
I don't want a populist death penalty, thank you very much. Because a populist death penalty will come probably with the Blairite justice system and all the things which I think make execution currently impossible. I don't think reformers ever thought about the criminal justice system, and I doubt very much whether it has a coherent idea of how to put it right. So that wouldn't fill me with joy either.
So yours, at this point, is a philosophical or theoretical support, which so far you don't see any practical application.
In general, there is no transmission belt between what I think and anybody likely to be in government. So that's where I live. Well, I'm saying if there were such a thing, and if I were able to influence the actions of government and the legislation of Parliament, then I know exactly what programme would be desirable to make it possible to reintroduce a death penalty for heinous murder, which, as I say, would also be desirable and would increase the level of justice and peace in our society.
So if you were summoned to the cabinet, put into the House of Lords as Lord Hitchens and made Justice Minister, would that be a role you would take up with enthusiasm?
I think actually that do I have to answer? Do I have to answer all the reasons why A, that won't happen, and B, the sort of person who the role of junior ministers in government and their importance and more importantly their unimportance? No, I'm sorry. Those things are not going to happen.
Lord Hitchens, thank you for your time today. That was Peter, not yet Lord Hitchens, giving his very thoughtful and somewhat nuanced defence of why the death penalty should be considered or perhaps reintroduced in some theoretical future once the justice system has also been fixed. Thanks to him for his time, and thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.